things out of bounds. It is not, and the problem is that what cancel culture is doing is taking whatever information they have and saying, all right, in summary, this whole person should not exist, which is, of course,
no. It's saying the ideas don't exist.
Well, that's what they should mean, but what they're doing is canceling everything that they can possibly think of to remove them from visibility, which is basically unforgiving.
Depends on what the person is saying.
Well, you'd think so. You'd think it would be proportional to what the problem is.
Right.
But
so the example would be, is it acceptable? So Holocaust deniers will say all the time that that there's so this is long before the concept of cancel culture existed. Holocaust deniers would put advertisements in university newspapers, and they would say they want an open conversation about the existence of the Holocaust.
Right.
And that because academics has silenced their ability to present their argument and their evidence.
Well,
but actually, their argument is not to present facts. Simply the presence of the debate is what they want, because they want to undermine, they want to express anti-Semitism by simply challenging and presenting a case for a conspiracy theory. So let me finish. So this is the problem. When you're dealing with people who are presenting things that are not fact, but using a public forum to undermine confidence in facts and principle, then you've got a problem, because they're abusing the public sphere for purposes that are not rational discourse. They're using the public sphere simply to spread anger and express reactions.
Sure. And so Trump's Twitter account and Facebook account were canceled because he was continuously doing the unacceptable in public.
But that's not the word cancel.
No.
But you see,
But he was not canceled.
I disagree with what I see here, because I think it would be like us having an issue with the Holocaust denier, going to the public media and finding out that he has had a bankruptcy and that he got divorced and has speeding tickets.
That's not cancel culture. Cancel culture is.
But what I have seen is when they go after people for something that, albeit may be bad, theoretically to have declared bankruptcy or whatever, or even being jailed for speeding, but that has nothing to do with the issue in question. And this is what I have seen done a lot.
That's sort of what that point was
that's
about.
Not my understanding of it. My understanding of cancel culture is that it's a accusation that's levied by one side when their views are when culture has shifted and someone's views are no longer considered acceptable to say, like using the N-word in public. There was a time you could use the N-word in public, and then it changed. And so cancel culture is saying, you're canceling my ability to express my opinion because I want to use the N-word. And what's really happened is society has shifted. And so the person feels silenced in their inability to go into public to use these terms, when in fact what's happening is there's a large group of the people who don't want to hear this person speak anymore in the way that they're speaking.
Yeah. So there's actually two very different ideas about what cancel culture is.
Yes.
Because if cancel culture, well, first of all, the term itself means cancel, completely, obliterate, okay? And so what that suggests is that what Jacques was implying, that not only a person is saying totally unacceptable things,
right,
but not only their unacceptable things will I prohibit from being heard, but I will prohibit him from living. If I can find that he is in debt, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, the complaint is that the complaint from the person being canceled is that he's being unfairly canceled in every way, shape, or form,
Right. So,
which
for
is,
instance,
which
I'll give you
is,
an
should
example.
not be the case.
So, for instance, a person who says uses racist language, and they're an actor or an artist. There are a lot of people who say, I'm not going to buy their records. I'm not going to listen to their television programs because of the things that they say. So then the person does have financial consequences of their public speech.
And that is a perfectly reasonable thing, but it's appropriate for the crime that is committed. But if you go after them, for example, and which is done in a number of times, is that certain of the public figures have given the private address of somebody and say, why don't you go to their door and tell them about all this? And of course, they end up getting firebombed. And so that,
like physically a bomb.
yeah,
exploding
yeah,
in their
yeah.
house.
And that's basically one of the issues of domestic terrorism, that the quote, nice politicians exhort their minions to cancel everything about somebody, for example, that, you should undoubtedly do terrible things
even
to
go
the
further.
president because he's a socialist, right?
In Texas, they've now actually legislated that
Yeah.
you're supposed to denounce someone.
Right.
And so you're right. But I don't think that's,
Okay.
I think we're exceeding the definition of what
Well,
consequential action means.
I just keep thinking about, there's a group of it that affects me in my other life called KC tenants. I'm a big believer that tenants should have rights. But when this specific group that's masterminded by a woman here from Kansas City who's a lawyer, and when they decide to go after somebody, they'll show, look, he drives a Mercedes while his tenants live with rats. And there are a million reasons why the guys may have rats, and the fact that he drives a Mercedes has nothing to do with the people having the rats,
Well, it relates
it
to
does.
his
think
being
it does.
rich and they're poor.
Right. It has to do with that he's rich and they're poor.
Right. The
I
question-
think we're
the question
talking
is-
two totally different,
Two
three
different topics.
subjects
Yeah,
now.
three different
We
topics.
got three, because the paper I sent
Yeah,
had to do with the concept of forgiveness.
right.
And that is that, can a person who has sinned pretty badly
Right.
and has been ostracized or eliminated from, can he be resuscitated?
Right.
Can he be forgiven?
That's
And
it.
of course, the point is that only if he genuinely
Changes his
repents
behavior.
what his behavior is,
That's right.
right?
So.
And that's
so-
pretty simple-minded.
So to fit it back into the conversation we were just having, if you have someone who spouts rabid anti-Semitic language and denies the Holocaust, and then and the reaction is from other people to say, we don't want you speaking in our public venues because you're not actually here to have a real conversation. You're here to spew hatred. So if that person then changes, and there are cases where this happens, where you have people, particularly young people who got involved in gangs where they adopt anti-Semitic language, and then later in life, they realize that they got sucked into this, basically into a cult, and they decide that, and they change their ways. Those people are welcomed back into the community. They're not canceled as human beings.
I have a comment here. Why is it acceptable to cancel anyone? Why shouldn't unpopular views be countered with facts rather than just pounding the offender into the ground?
Because what we're talking about is situations where facts are not the point of the discussion. We're talking about situations where people are using public forums simply to express hatred and to undermine rational discourse. This is something that we were so believed it didn't exist in earlier decades, but it has transformed. And actually, one of the first places where we saw this was with Holocaust denial, where people were using the forum simply to express anti-Semitic hatred, had nothing to do with the facts. There really wasn't a real debate going on.
Well, I'm not defending Holocaust deniers by any stretch of the imagination, but Don't we live in a country where we are allowed to express our views? Regardless of what they are.
There's a difference. There's a difference
I
between.
have an answer on 13. I would say that you are allowed to be wrong on your ideas, but not on your facts. And the problem of Holocaust denial, that they would say like there were no gas chambers.
But there's something else. You can express your views, but I don't have to listen to them.
That's right. Don't listen to them. Instead of pounding somebody into the ground, just tune him out.
But we have institutions of a public sphere, and those institutions, newspapers, universities, social media companies, they have an obligation as media to promote ideas that are fact-based. So that's what journalism does. That's why you go to get a degree in journalism, is you learn how to base your facts, your arguments and facts, or you have a separate area called an op-ed. And everyone knows that an op-ed is an opinion piece. So we don't have Facebook, Twitter doesn't have the same kind of rigors of training for the people who publish it, but they still have an obligation to present facts. So when their company is being used by someone to promote, hey, they do have an obligation to stop it speaking. It's moral and it's legal, because very famously, the Supreme Court decided that you don't have the freedom of speech to say that, to yell fire in a crowded church, right? So we recognize in our society that freedom of speech is limited in certain ways. And that's not to say that we still don't want lots of debate to take place. But when a person crosses over a line to hate speech, then we don't accept it. And so I actually want to, I don't want to stop the conversation, but there's another topic that's very closely related to this that has to do with resilience that I think is really quite interesting. But Pat, did you want to reply to that before we move on?
Well, I have lots of places I could go with this discussion, but I think they would take us off the path that you want to go, Drew. So you're in charge, and I'm.
We have lots of time because we're all hungry and we don't want to think about that. So, okay, so here's the story I want to tell you, and it's going to come back to this exact issue. It's going to take me a few minutes to get there. And Jacques, I want you to pay attention.
I am.
Okay. So I think the Scheinmans already heard some of this story because you guys were on my Zoom presentation. So I'm sorry if it's repetitive. So, but in 1941, between the retreat of the Soviet army and the arrival of the Nazi army in the middle of the war, some of the towns in the eastern part of Poland and the Ukraine took it upon themselves to slaughter their Jewish neighbors. These were pogroms that were initiated by locals, not by the Nazis. Now, they were looking down the street saying the Nazis are coming. Maybe we're going to make the Germans happy by killing our Jews first. But here's the interesting thing about this particular set of killings. They happened in some towns and not in others. So a group of scientists, of scholars, started scratching their heads and saying, what made all of these towns were multi-ethnic and multi-religious. As Jacques can tell you, he's been to most of these places. Back then, there were Jews, there were Catholics, there were some Protestants, there were Ruthenians and Ukrainians and Polish speakers and Lithuanians. It was all a gigantic mix-up. In other words, it's a place that looks very much like us. A place where lots of different ethnic groups and religions live together. What was it that made some of those communities more resilient to the prospect of the coming Nazis, that they didn't kill their neighbors, where the other ones jumped at the chance to attack and kill? So this group of social scientists have a theory. They got it from another guy. It's called the power threat analysis. A power threat analysis says, my group is going to react with more violence if the other group is close to or equal in my power and dominance. And by the way, by that close to or equal, it could also be vocal in their reaction. So they may not be actually demographically equal to my group, but they just may be really loud. What do they mean? They mean that at this point in time in Eastern European history, after living in empires for many years, all the different national groups had plans for a nation state. The Ukrainians wanted their own nation state. Some of the Poles wanted a Poland that was multi-ethnic. Other Poles wanted a Poland that was only Catholic and Polish speaking. Some of the Jews wanted to go to Israel. Other Jews wanted to stay there but wanted to have autonomy. In other words, there were competing visions for what their country was going to look like. So the scholars looked at all the evidence and looked at all the possible factors for why there was violence. And what they concluded was the violence took place in those towns where the two ethnic groups were not only almost equal in power, but they were very vocal about how much they hated the other side.
Oh, wait, but the two ethnic groups means Jews and non-Jews, or
Ukrainians and Poles, or
right. Because there is a book about that called Erased that talks about that, about why in Ukraine, they make a point of when there's a site of a massacre, they would put here lie 50,000 Ukrainian patriarchs, when in reality there are 50,000 Jews.
This is going back to before the violence took place. That's already down the line of the story of why they're erasing that memory.
Right.
This is in the actual cause of the initial spark for genocide. In other words, two groups who feel challenged by each other, say it the other way. If one group really is dominant, the Poles really are dominant, and there are not very many Ukrainians, there's no reason for genocide. The genocide takes place when the two groups feel threatened by the other one. And sometimes it's simply the verbal antagonism that creates that sense of power threat. So, coming back to our topic from before, I don't like using the word cancel culture because I think we were talking about multiple issues, as John pointed out. But what we're talking about is two groups who have two very different visions, or multiple groups that have very different visions for what the United States should look like. And those two groups are now refusing to listen to each other and saying, we don't want to hear those views at all. So that is the kind of atmosphere that existed in Poland. But the Poles were presented with the exact same challenge. So let's go back in time again to the 1930s. As I said, two different visions for Poland. One was, on the right, was Catholic Poland, Polish-speaking Poland. Jews are not included, Ukrainians are not included, all those groups get excluded. The other vision of Poland was multi-ethnic Poland. Everyone is Polish if you live in the state, and we can have a Poland that tolerates lots of different groups. So now let's imagine our cancel culture back in the 1930s. The two sides disagree with each other. The right side says, Poland only for Poles and only for Catholics. What's the multi-ethnic side supposed to do? Should they say, stop it, we don't want to hear this. This is unacceptable language. We're going to cancel this conversation. Because in the moment that they do that, what's going to be the response? It's going to actually accelerate the conflict between the two groups, and it's going to lead to more violence. Did you follow the story, what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
I'm trying to show you a certain parallel that in the situation where two groups see each other as ethnic differences with different visions for what the country should look like, even if you say this is an unacceptable form of speech, it's just going to exacerbate the hatred between the two groups, and they're going to listen to each other less. So what do? Do you allow the other side to have their say and then promote a state that's completely different based on values that you don't agree with? Or do you say, no, those values are completely unacceptable, they don't fit my morality, I want to stop having that conversation, which then exacerbates the difference between the two groups? So what's interesting in this book, it's a very small argument, and they didn't have a lot of concrete evidence for it, but I think it's really interesting for Jews to think about. One of the points, the side points that they make, is they looked again at these different communities, which communities were able to avoid violence and which ones were able to become more violent. The ones that were able to become more violent, the ones that were able to avoid violence, the Jewish population was integrated but not assimilated. The communities where the Jews were, where there was more violence, the Jews were integrated and assimilated. What does that mean? Integrated means I'm walking down the street and I see my non-Jewish neighbor and I say, how are you? I go into a shop, I buy my shirts from him. And when he has Christmas, I say, Merry Christmas. And when I have holidays, he says, Happy New Year.
Or Happy Yom Kippur.
Happy Yom Kippur,
As we hear all
as they
day.
say all the time, right? Exactly. But he has his community and I have my community. That was a more resilient community as compared to the community where the Jews got rid of their curls, they got rid of their Jewish hats and their Jewish clothing, they dressed as Poles and they intermarried with Poles and they lived as Poles. In those situations where the Jews lost their Jewishness, they were more vulnerable to violence. It's counterintuitive, but why do you think it's true?
No, I don't know, but wait, but when I did the research,
They weren't butting heads against them.
They weren't, exactly, they were not butting, it wasn't a power threat analysis, but the difference was you couldn't identify a Jewish community. And me, as a Christian, I wasn't used to recognizing my Jewish neighbor's rights to exist. So it's like the flip side of the power threat analysis, that one of the ways to create a resilient community is for Jewish people to say to their Muslim neighbors, we like that you have your own sub-community in our neighborhood, and we support you. We're used to thinking about our society as a society where there are other groups who don't always share my values.
but I don't know, and it's always anecdotal because only based on my experience.
Right.
But when I was writing the book with Bill, we tried to find Hasidic Jews who had been hidden by, because we wrote a, maybe you don't know, we wrote a book about the Jews who survived the Holocaust in Poland by being hidden by Polish Gentiles.
Right.
And we tried as much as we did to find Hasidic Jews, people who are totally not integrated,
Right.
and we couldn't find anyone.
I think Hasidic is a little bit more, I think that's later in the process. Your story, as again, is at a point where the genocide's already taken place.
Right. Yes.
Right. So this is talking about the early stages. And I'll give you an example from my interviews when I did my research in the 90s, years ago, when I wrote my first book. And you guys have heard these stories before. When you walk down the street in the town of Hildesheim and you saw your neighbor, you would shake their hand, you would tip your hat, you would curtsy, you would say, good morning, Herr Dr. So-and-so, Herr good morning, Herr Dr. Scheinman, Frau Dr. Scheinman. It was all very proper. And when I would ask my interview partners, well, what about like the people who were Catholics, if you were Protestant, or what if you were Jewish? They said, oh, of course, we always greeted everyone. This was, in fact, such a strong norm to treat your neighbors with respect that a kid who didn't do this and was seen by another neighbor, just a random neighbor, you take him by the ear, drag him back home, and tell the parents, your son did not properly greet their neighbor. My favorite story is there was a flasher on the street of this working class Catholic family. And the mother was very upset because her daughter had to go to school every day and he would try to show his equipment. And she was told she had to greet him and then go back. Another great story. In a working class neighborhood, there was a middle class butcher's family. And this butcher's family was very conscious of itself as middle class. And all around them were communists and socialists. And she said, and I said, well, did you greet them when you walked down the street? She said, of course we did. We did it because they were communists. In other words, we made a point of greeting them properly because there was the potential for social conflict. So this fits into the argument that these two scholars are making, because what it suggests is that a society is more resilient, not when you agree with your neighbors, but when you still treat them with respect and you recognize their right to exist as a part of your community. Those are the communists. They believe what they believe, but I'm not going to tell them I totally disagree with everything they have to say, but I'm going to recognize their right to be part of my community. And that is something that is essential. So to bring it back to the cancel culture problem that we raised at the beginning, on the one hand, we have evidence that suggests that the more the two sides disagree with each other, the more likely it's going to lead to violence. And I think we see that in the United States today. On the other hand, the United States has a really strong tradition of recognizing people in your community who are not you and saying, I want to be part of I recognize your right to be in my community, even if I totally disagree with all the other things that you say. And that's a factor that can help us build resilient communities, I think.
Well, if you want to carry the next, skipping back to the origins of social democrats in Germany.
Yes.
And that was one of the points I took from our visit to the Auschwitz exhibit, where the very subtle ways of disrespect were adopted more and more by the general population, so that while there were the lunatics, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, the others would say, yeah, Heil Hitler, just raise your hand a little bit. I'm not really participating. I don't take it seriously. But behind that particular greeting was I am different. I believe in the abomination of everything but me. And so little by little.
So let me ask, Pat, let's take this as an example, because this was central to my research. This is one of the core arguments of my book.
I remember the photo of the guy holding.
That's right, exactly. What does it mean? Should the ordinary Germans in the 1930s allow their neighbors to say Heil Hitler prior to the arrival of Hitler in power? Or should they have canceled that? Should they have said, no, this is unacceptable. I refuse to recognize what you're doing? Is that freedom of speech to say Heil Hitler? Or is that by doing it, already breaking the fundamental rules of civility that keep our communities intact? When I say Heil Hitler, I'm saying everyone knew kill Jews. That's what it meant. That was the symbol. And he didn't say kill Jews, but you knew what he meant. So right at that moment, it's already breaking down the structures that enabled human beings to live together in peace. I'll give you a very physical reason for it. You can see it, Jonathan. I've done this for you guys before. What's different by us? Guten Morgen, Dr. Shaban, right? Right? Or pilot.
Well, obviously.
It's obvious, right? I'm literally not touching my fellow human beings anymore. I'm challenging them, and I'm instead of putting civility in our relationship, I'm putting politics in our relationship. I'm saying you either are with or against Hitler,
And so the conclusion from that little example
right?
is pretty simple. The guy comes up to me and says, Heil Hitler, Herr Bergerson.
Yeah.
And I say, hi, how are you doing? How's your
morning.
wife?
Is that really so simple? Let's think.
No,
this
it
through for a
isn't,
minute.
but it is an example
Right.
of how you counter without fight.
Can I tell you something? I remember in Latin America, very Catholic, and then comes not only people wish you like Merry Christmas, but they would say like something like, "Oh, que Jesús Cristo lo ayude." May Jesus Christ
Right.
bless you, help you.
Right.
And people who I have worked with, they would say, que Jesús Cristo lo ayude. May your Christ. Yes. So it's how they work around.
So actually this becomes a problem. Okay, so up to 1933, it's not an issue, but then Hitler's in power. So now you're a non-Jewish person, and you're walking down the street and someone comes up to you and says, Heil Hitler. And this is breaking with the tradition that you were raised in, which was, I'm going to treat all my neighbors with respect. I'm going to say good morning to them, regardless of whether they're Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or working class or middle class or whatever, or prostitutes or whatever. I'm going to treat all my neighbors with respect. Now, I'm being asked to greet my neighbor that specifically disrespects another group of neighbors in my own community, right? That's saying this one target group should be removed from my community. What do I do? What are my choices? I could say, Heil Hitler back because I'm scared that they're going to beat me up or I'm going to lose a job. I could say good morning. What's the impact on my family if I say good morning and the Nazis are all saying Heil Hitler? I'm a painter, let's say. I paint houses.
People won't hire you anymore.
I'm going to lose my livelihood because the Nazis control public business. They control all the big contracts, right? So the Nazis are really, really good at placing the risk on the victims for what they do. This is why cancel culture exists. The reason why in the definition I was using for it, not the one that you were using, which was about attacking people's homes. I'm not using that definition. The reason why people are saying, no, we're not going to accept this kind of language, and they're saying it publicly, is because violent language should be unacceptable on principle, because it places the victim in the role of having to defend themselves. My wife experiences this all the time. Whenever there's any issue at school about race, they all look at JJ and they want JJ to say, my wife's African-American. I don't know if you even knew that. They want her to be the one to explain what they should do about race. No, that's placing the victim in the position of telling the people who are in a position of power what they should do. It's crazy. It needs for white people to be standing there saying, no, we need to be allies for the victim. So that's why people are saying this language is unacceptable, because they're trying to be allies to the victims and say certain language is unacceptable anymore. We don't want to use that anymore. But that brings us back to the original dynamic. One group now feels that they don't even have a voice in their own community, and the other group feels like the tenor of conversation has fallen apart. And the result of the two of them is that they now see each other as a power threat. How do we get out of that? How do we avoid that problem?
So what do you do as an academic? Because this has happened very recently at MU, at KU, all of the places.
All of the universities have agreed with Pat that any speech is acceptable. I totally disagree with this. Because universities, I edit speech all the time. That's 90% of my job.
Oh, you're wrong, Drew. Not all universities are like that. Many speakers who represent the right side of the political spectrum have been canceled, who have had speeches canceled when they were already contracted. And so don't tell me that universities do that, because they don't.
I meant I'm sorry, I didn't speak correctly. I was referring to Missouri. The Missouri system has said that all speech is allowed. And what I was saying, you're right. In Berkeley, they canceled speeches. You're absolutely right.
And not just Berkeley, but yes.
Yeah. So, but the other example of canceled speech, the other big example of canceled speech was the BDS movement, right? So the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel that was lodged by Palestinian activists saying that they want to pressure Israel economically in order to get them to move out of territory that they consider to be theirs. So legislation was passed in Germany that said that if you support BDS, you cannot be invited to a German university. Legislation was passed in France to the same effect. They said this entire form of speech is not acceptable.
And also several states have passed laws
Yeah.
prohibiting BDS
That's right.
from any contractor who
Right.
to be able to, but
How do you feel about that, John? How do you feel about that? And Drew, how do you feel about that?
I think it's probably terrible to either cancel BDS or to give it the dignity of recognizing it as such. I think that because what it is doing is it is expressing complete cancel culture over a single target in favor of one single target. Now, I do favor a modification of that idea. So, example, the ice cream people,
Ben and Jerry.
Ben and Jerry's, all right, and which they said they are withdrawing business in the West Bank because they are using resources that have previously, by previous agreements, been designated as future resources for the Palestinians. And so they said, "Sure, well, everybody can buy Ben and Jerry's here, but we're not going to make it in the West Bank and sell it there because the people, by doing so, we are supporting the utilization of resources that have been previously designated for the Palestinians." And this is a subtle difference, but to me, it's very important. I mean, and I ran into a terrible problem because I drink fizzy water every meal. And it's made by SodaStream. And SodaStream used to manufacture in bank. They moved out. So I'm off the hook. But that whole concept of BDS is a very, very difficult one for Jews because it sounds like a cancel culture against Israel. And in fact, it may very well be because of the complete unevenness of its application. For example, but in apartheid in South Africa, we did boycott. We boycotted because of the state policy of apartheid, right? So it is a difficult issue.
So that the comparison, which by the way I don't agree with, I don't believe that it's apartheid, but the distinction that you just made I think is essential. So I think BDS has the right to express its views. I don't agree with them, but I think they have the right to express them because I would draw a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is a criticism of specific policies of the Israeli state. Anti-Semitism is an attack against Jews as people. And so I would draw a distinction between a political criticism and the other. Now let me qualify what I just said. First of all, I think for many people, the anti-Zionism is a shield for anti-Semitism, number one. And number two, at its fundamental level, BDS is asking for a right to return to Israel that would remove the Jewish quality of the state. So in its demands, at a fundamental level, unless that specific requirement were removed, it is still asking for the destruction of the state of Israel. So that would be the two reasons why, for me, it crosses over the boundary.
I haven't seen any evidence of its supporting the right of return under BDS.
It's a
I've only
core-
seen that the right of the independent state, but not of the right of
No, no, no.
return.
It's a core principle of the movement. So again, this is requiring careful distinctions, and there are lots of people who are going to use this language as shields for other conversations. So we have to be very careful in making these distinctions. But let's get now to the underlying problem. The underlying problem is, just like in Israel and Palestine, you have two competing national visions, right? Each group, each ethnic group says, I have a vision for a nation state, and this is what the nation state should look like. And it excludes the other group. In the United States, we have two different visions of what the United States is going to look like in the future. Is it going to continue to be dominated by white men? Or is it going to be a more multi-ethnic, diverse population that's going to allow a lot of those other populations to share in power and wealth and influence? So really, that's the problem that I find to be the underlying tension, because each of those groups are going to justify what is freedom of speech or what is not freedom of speech based on their political agenda. And each one of them is going to see any speech by the other side as a threat to their national vision. So that's why Netanyahu encouraged the European governments to ban BDS discourse, because it conflicted with his vision for the future of Israel. And by the way, that's why Palestinian students oppose speeches by Israeli ministers at universities, because it opposes their vision of a nation state. So in a power threat analysis, the more vocal you get, the more the other side seems to be dangerous. Yes.
It occurred to me that, and I've been wrestling with this, that the Republicans, since Trump and even before Trump came to power, the Republicans are just letting it go by that Trump's lies are okay. How many lies did he tell? An average number of lies per day was like 17 or something like that.
Right.
And so here he is. So the Republicans are buying into this like it's okay. And you have people who are saluting this as like, followers that they are. I think fundamentally, if you carry that forward, so the next leader will lie all he wants to,
Right.
and it becomes glorified.
So this is the argument for that a boundary has been crossed. If you remove civility and if you remove facts from public discourse, then it's no longer public discourse in the way that we conceive of it in the modern period. The public sphere is no longer operating the way it was, which arguably was always faulted. There were always problems with it, but it was based on facts and it was based on civility. So we need to be civil. We need to respect other people's views. We need to accept other people as members of our community. But the very moment that this was the dilemma that the interwar Poles faced. The very moment that that one side said, I want to accept all voices, and we should include the voices of the people who want to destroy the idea of accepting all people's voices. That's the contradiction. That's the limit where we run into a problem. But the lesson of history for me, and the thing that keeps me up at night, is the Ukrainian nationalists in Poland who slaughtered their Jewish neighbors out of fear of a revived Polish state. It sounds crazy, right?
Because they saw that the Jews would side
Would
the
side
Poles
with-
against.
By the way, and the Poles thought that the Jews were going to side with the Ukrainians, and that's why the Jews got killed.
Right.
Okay, so those Ukrainian nationalists, there is nothing you were going to be able to tell them that was going to reduce their fear, because their fear was not rational. It wasn't based in regular discourse. It was based in a perception of danger coming from the other side.
It brings to mind Father Dubois.
By the way, if you want to come up and join the microphone, the wire doesn't last,
Okay.
stretch long enough.
Mike and I had the privilege of helping bring Father Dubois to Vail, Colorado, with the help of a young man who,
Who's Father Dubois?
I'm sorry?
The guy who wrote the book Holocaust by Bullets.
Oh, okay.
yeah, oh, Father Dubois, you don't, okay, Father Dubois, Holocaust by Bullets. So if we bring, so we help bring him to Vail, and he's something that just stunned me, because he talked in the Vail Interfaith Chapel. He would not speak in a chapel if it was Catholic or Protestant or what, but if it was an interfaith chapel, he's okay. And he was there, and he gave a marvelous talk with slides. One of the things that struck me was that he said when he takes these trips with the volunteers to go with him, he cannot take Jews, because he will not. Because I think that he is afraid that their identity will be unmasked. And but anyway, he's an amazing. He went on to speak at the Vail school district for like a couple of days, and I mean, he's done some really pretty amazing work.
So those of us who were ignorant.
Focusing on the Einsatzgruppen.
I'm sorry?
So
The mobile
focus on the
killing
mobile killing squads rather than the gas chambers.
Oh,
Okay, so the term is Holocaust by bullet rather than Holocaust by gas.
oh.
So anyway, that's all I had to say.
So more people died those in the pits of Eastern Europe than died in some of the.
I don't think so. I asked Martin Gilbert
What?
once. I asked Martin Gilbert.
In any one camp, not in all the camps.
Yeah, no, yeah.
In all the camps.
The majority of people were killed in the Holocaust were killed by gas.
But we can think of.
I don't think that's what I saw.
No, that's-
But the mobile killing squads killed more than died in Treblinka or that died in
Yeah,
Majdanek.
it's about 1.5 million people
Yeah.
were killed by the
Right,
mobile
so
killing units.
it's the scale of killing was equivalent to about one of the deaths.
Right. For instance, like
That's what I was trying to say.
all the population of the village where Denise's family came from. Because I'm the only one in the family who has been there. I'm not even related to those people.
So this raises kind of the problem that we're facing today, is that we have two groups that feel that their vision of the future of the United States feels threatened by the other group, and they are not listening to each other, and they are no longer civil with each other, because they feel like this other side is so undermining the fundamental principles of what makes America great, right? And there is not a focus on facts, certainly on one side, and details. There's not kind of productive discourse that's going on. There's a lot of lying and misrepresentation of facts. And so the potential for power threat is high. In another 20 years, this issue is probably going to be resolved, because the number of Latinos is going to be so much higher than currently, that the demographic transition will take place, and white America will no longer be in a majority. But we're right on the edge. We're right on that cusp. So it's right at the moment that those things are the most dangerous, where people feel like they're losing power or they're gaining power, and they're being very vocal about it. That violence is more likely.
You said two groups.
Oh,
I'm counting at least 5.
you could absolutely have, you could have made it much more complicated. I was trying to.
It's, you
Yeah.
see the white male versus the groups, and it is very convoluted.
Well, yes, absolutely, because there are different groups that have different interests, and they ally with, right, so there's business conservatives who are very different from the racists, absolutely. but they coalesce into coalitions.
Right.
And there are differences on the left as well that are very significant between moderate Democrats and progressive Democrats. And those groups don't necessarily agree with each other either.
For simplicity's sake, I can see where you're keeping it into.
I'm putting it into ethnic groups
Right.
because at a certain level, there's a fundamental structural change going on in the United States.
Right.
Since the 17th century, white Protestants ruled the United States
Absolutely.
up to the election of Kennedy in the 60s and Martin Luther King. And it started to change, but we're in a transition period still.
Right.
And there's more participation by other groups, but they're not in a position where they're dominant, except perhaps in entertainment industries. That's maybe the exception, where
Right.
Jews have been very dominant and Blacks are now very dominant as well in sports, in terms of public figures. But it still hasn't translated into a fundamental shift in the structure of the way the government works.
Right.
We still have an electoral system that was based on slavery. We still have a police system that was based on slavery. We have uneven distribution of wealth that was based on the profits of slavery and early industrialization. So all those things are shifting, but they're not shifting very fast. And it's right at that moment that danger happens. So to go back to the German case, Brüning, the guy who was the conservative who ran the government right before the Nazis took power, he said, if I had had one more year, we would never have had Hitler. Because if he had just been able to get the economy back going a little bit more stable, the protests wouldn't have taken place. The whole situation would have been avoided. It happened at the worst possible moment in German history, right when change was actually taking place. Sorry, this is a very depressing topic for Yom Kippur today.
Now, do you think that's what Trump was attempting?
No, he was totally interested in his own benefit. Yeah, but he
had a lot of hate speech, and it's still.
Well, that's because
it appealed and it worked.
It was for power.
It was neat. So, but let's take an example of a destruction of civility. You all know the photo. I'm reluctant to do it, but when Trump mocked a handicapped man by putting his hand up, never before in the history of American politics was something like that done
Right.
by a public official. So there's an evidence of a barbarization of politics, of an incivility, and his supporters were supporting him because not all of them. There's a coalition there, but a core of his supporters were supporting him because they wanted the right to use that kind of language. They like calling handicapped people idiots or whatever
Right,
language
right.
they use. So let's bring it back to the original question. What do you do when someone uses language like that? And it's not an individual using it, it's a person using it in order to encourage other people to be indecent to other human beings, right? He's using it for his own power, but he's empowering them to be aggressive and violent towards a whole social class of people. Do we cancel it, say this is unacceptable, which is only going to reinforce their feeling that they're being oppressed, that they're being silenced, that they're not being able to say their mind, and it's going to divide the society even more? Or do we not cancel it? Do we let it go and not be allies and bystanders for the victims, the handicapped people who are being publicly humiliated? Here's the point. This is what Nazis do. Nazis solicit the aid of victims and bystanders in their own agenda by creating impossible situations like the one we just saw. So let me tell you what one of my interview partners did that totally blew me away. She was Protestant. She was married to a Jewish guy. I've told you guys this story before. You know this one already. She was married to a Jewish man, and this Jewish man absolutely refused to admit that he was anything other than German. He was Jewish, and he was German, and he was going to stay in Germany. And she kept trying to tell him, can we just get out of here? They visited New York in 1938 and went back to Germany That's how much denial this guy was in, okay? So the choice she made when she was walking down the street is very difficult. You walk it down the street and you see your neighbor and the neighbor says, Heil Hitler. Do you agree with them? Do you say Heil Hitler too and disrespect your neighbor? Like
Your spouse.
your spouse, right? Do you say good day and put your family at risk and publicly announce that you're against the regime, which has concentration camps and could put you in prison and could beat you up? Either choice is bad. So what does she do? She walks on the other side of the street and acts like she doesn't know her neighbors. So when we ask, why do social groups isolate themselves from each other? Where does this divide come? In this case, it came from a person's well-intentioned desire to avoid conflict with her neighbors so that she wouldn't have to put anyone in difficult situations. Imagine she walked up to her neighbor and they see her and they have to choose. Do I say Heil Hitler in front of everyone? Or do I say good day in front of everyone? She said, you know what? I'm just gonna not act like I don't even talk to my neighbors. I'm just gonna hide myself. And the result is we have a divided society where those two groups aren't talking anymore. But there's even.
But you see, we have the same problem right now. What do we do about, I mean, look, I play tennis Sunday night, 8 or 9 other people, all of them very far right.
Right.
And we usually go out to eat after. And a couple of them are very, very kindly good people, do wonderful things, teach the Sunday school, etc. Everything wonderful, but they just happen to go along for some reason with all these things that I think are crazy. And the others are just rampant loonies, you know. I mean, I was going to say, by the way, it's perfectly clear why we need to get rid of the Jews, because of those wealthy Jews who bought the space lasers that caused the
They
California
said that to you
wildfires.
in front of you?
Yeah, the wildfires. I mean, we did it. I mean, it was terrible. That was Marjorie, what's her name?
Wait. So one of your tennis partners said that in.
Well, no, she didn't say that, but several other things that were similarly crazy.
Right.
And, you know, it's something that bothers me because I can deal with a couple of them on a rational basis, you know. Vaccine, you know, none of these people have been
Right.
vaccinated. All right.
So
they
isn't that-
refuse.
Isn't that great? If
No,
they
it
hope-
isn't. They're not
But then
going
they
to die.
die.
No, they will not die. That's the problem.
So let's take the space. Can we choose the space lasers for a minute? Because that's a great example, right? You all know the space laser story, right? So the idea was that Jews are so powerful that they have put all their money together to build a giant space laser that then they can use to attack the world, but also specifically then cause the California wildfires to distract us and to win political, to convince us that climate change exists, even though climate change really doesn't exist. Okay. So what's the problem with this? Number one, it is not based in any facts whatsoever. Simply the mentioning of it and bringing it into discourse. Do we believe that people should have the freedom of speech? Yes. Did we silence them from saying it? No. But when they bring it into discourse, they are promoting a form of conspiracy thinking that is generating anti-Semitism. Why is this anti-Semitic? I feel like I'm in my class. Who can tell me why this is anti-Semitic?
You mean the fact that the Jews have so much money that they buy the
They
space?
have money and they have power. That's an ancient trope of anti-Semitism. It dates back centuries. So it really is hate speech disguised in not just lies, but in conspiracy theories. What happens if we cancel it? If we say, if Facebook says, no, this is a story that
Then they said so much true that they're shutting me up.
they're shutting me up. In
Because
other words,
Zuckerberg.
the power threat analysis just gets that much worse. That's the dynamic I'm trying to show you. That's the catch-22 of this kind of thinking. that it reinforces itself, and then they're utterly convinced that the Jews are really powerful.
Well, they stopped. I know that Facebook has stopped shutting people out. It's just showing that it's not based on fact.
Well,
That's
I don't know
one,
on
that's
Facebook,
one,
so I
that's
can't-
one strategy.
Yeah.
The other strategy is, did you all see Black Klansmen?
yes.
Oh, great film, right? The other is to
No, but
engage.
I think they'll get caught, right, by the other clansmen.
But the point is to engage with the people on a human level, the way that you're doing, and try to encourage them to see you as in your own example as someone who's different. Are there enough Jews to really alter all the perceptions of the people in the world? No way. Are we going to change their perceptions? No, we're not, because we never have been able to. But it's a very difficult problem.
But you see, it isn't just a Jewish problem.
No, it's a problem for
It
any
is-
victim
it is a
population.
US survival of democracy problem.
It's a problem for any victim population, right? Where it's,
Well, but you say the word victim, remember that the primary argument from many who have vaccine denial, stolen the election, is that we are the victims. We are the victims.
That's-
We poor social democrats in
That's-
Germany are the victims.
that's what I'm trying to show you. I'm trying to show you that the moment you challenge someone on facts or discourse, they then place themselves in the victim position because of a power threat analysis. Because they're saying, you're silencing me because your views are not tenable because you're this other ethnic group. So that's why I placed it in two groups, to get back to your question. I placed it in two groups because in the end, I think it's all about ethnicity or race in the United States. I think it's all coded in terms of money and it's in terms of class, in terms of all these other things. But I do think that ultimately it's about which group that looks like me is in power and which group is not. Okay, I talked a lot. Pat, does that change your mind on the issue at all about, or give you more to think about in terms of the issue of freedom of speech?
Well, I I think I learned some things from you, and I appreciate that, and from what other people said. But I kind of wanted to back up to something that was said. I don't know who the speaker was. It seemed like attributing to all Republicans the defense of Trump, and I think that adds to this problem you have of when we hear that from the other side, and then we hear from the opposing candidate that all of us on the right are a basket of deplorables. That doesn't help either, Drew. So when I sit here and listen to you guys, I'm learning from you, but I'm also learning that you believe that your way is the only way, and you seem unwilling to listen to ideas from the other side of the aisle.
So I would argue that politics has shifted in the United States in the last 30, 40 years. And I think there's a wide range of ideas within the Democratic Party, for instance. And that range of ideas used to be the range of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. So the moderate Democrats are proposing and have been proposing policies that actually were developed by Republicans 20 or 30 years ago. So I would say that there is a lot of difference of opinion. And if you put you put a progressive and a centrist Democrat in the same room, they're going to have a big argument with each other. The difference is whether or not that boundary gets crossed to hatred and incivility. And the question you're asking is, can I support a party that supports a candidate who is expressing violence and still support the party but not support the candidate? And if this was a European system, I would say you could, because the Europeans have more parties, and so there's more negotiation. in a two-party system, at the end of the day, you either have to vote Republican or Democrat in the way our government works. And that means that if I vote Democrat, I'm supporting all the Democrats, not just the side that I like, even though I only like one part of the Democratic Party. When I vote Democrat, I have to recognize that I'm supporting the other side of the Democratic Party too, because those are the people who are getting into office.
And when I vote Republican, I have to realize the same thing about my party.
Right.
So I think a lot of problems would be resolved if leaders of both parties, not just those of us out in flyover country, but if the leaders of the parties could dial the rhetoric back. Because
So there's another reason why the rhetoric has gotten bad in the United States. Like,
and don't blame it all on the Republicans, Drew.
No, I'm going to blame it on gerrymandering. So what has happened in the structure of the way the country operates is that our districts have gotten so gerrymandered that there are very secure districts for 2/3 of the Democrats and Republicans. As a result, that means that those districts are going to go to the more extreme sides of both of those parties. So, because in the primary, the way that you're going to win over your party is to get your activists involved. So until we actually reform the gerrymandering problem, we will indeed have more aggressive language coming from both of the parties until there's a different system in place that's going to encourage politicians to be more moderate in their language than more aggressive.
Yes, and I'm curious because I don't know enough about this. How do you resolve that problem, Drew?
The Voting Rights Act is going to change it if it gets passed. And that's why it's so important to pass that. And it's why it's important for both parties. It will save both parties from extreme rhetoric. And I'm speaking, you all know me, I'm a wild lefty.
Yes, you are.
I'm telling you that it will improve both of the parties because it'll add for more, it'll make for more moderate districts across the whole United States. Other thing that would be better would be if we could use ranked choice voting, because then you could choose, you could say, I don't like this guy, but I like this guy in my party. And you could prefer the one that you like rather than of all the choices. That system has also proven to decrease the amount of money in politics and to decrease the amount of rancor in politics.
Can I help Pat with one idea that might be helpful to him? That you say that everybody, feels all Republicans are Trumpists. And of course, I don't believe that because I know it isn't true. But if in fact you have a system in which you're allowed to choose amongst different, quote, Republicans, then you can, in fact, support what you want rather than what somebody forces you to accept. And right now, you don't have that choice. You do within the Democratic Party, which is why it's at great risk.
And that's why it's on the edge of splitting apart.
Right. It's at great risk because here you have no problem whatsoever with, at least in the Congress, Mitch McConnell swear not a single Republican will do this. And they don't, not a word.
So again, if we were in a European system, Pat, I think we would all be in a position where we could then choose more carefully because there wouldn't be 2 different parties. There would be 5 different parties. And then there would be a business conservative party like there is in most European countries. And there would be a Green Party and there would be a Social Democratic Party. And those would be much more fine definitions of the kind of politics that each of us would like. By the way, parties then proceed to make compromises when they get into office. But that's the point is you get to at least feel good about yourself because you feel like you're voting for the person that you really want. The way the system works right now is it's skewed in a really complicated way.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Then, say, don't listen to anything Pat says. She's taking a medicine for pain, so she's not responsible.
Not responsible.
Drew,
I'm a witness to that.
Drew, do you think the Voting Act will pass?
My latest reading was about a week ago, and it looks like Manchin has come back and signaled that he would agree to, if you get rid of some of the changes, he didn't like the changes to the federal election commission. So they're going to get rid of that. And so he's moving more closer. The problem is the filibuster. And he's really a stickler for the filibuster. The filibuster is also a relic of slavery. So it's an institution that was created in order to protect slave states from the North. So again, like, as a historian, it's very hard for me to support it, but I understand the purpose of it. I really think that this is going to be the deciding factor on the success of our republic moving forward. And I think the Voting Rights Act will create an even playing ground that will allow more voices to be heard, and it will change, it would restore stability. But Biden, I got news for you, Biden is a very conservative Democrat. I mean, not in some of his policies, but when it comes to maintaining the traditions of the Senate, I think he identifies very closely with Manchin. So I'm not so sure Biden would overturn it either.
Thank you.
You know, the whole concept of victim and winner over history, you know, the white men won over the slaves, easy. And all the way along, somebody has remained very powerful. And the question that keeps coming up is, what do we owe to the victim? All right, because you can bet your bottom dollar that Jeff Bezos is not going to feel that he owes as much to the $7 an hour employee as that $7 employee thinks he is owed, right? And as long as you allow the winner to decide what the victim gets, it's the whole story of reparations, right, for slavery.
Another whole topic.
Another whole topic. But remember, if the person deciding is the person who in their name did it,
Right.
that does give them a tad bit of a leg up on this. And so when we turn and say to, on the simple things like crime, all right, it's perfectly obvious that more Black people are criminals than white people. Now, the fact that we happen to define them as criminals, and we would never have taken this charming young lady and given her a ticket and put her in prison for the rest of her life for speeding 1 mile an hour over the speed limit. But the fact is that we've made a level playing field, but it ain't that way. And so who decides?
So a great book on this topic is Open Season. It's written by a lawyer, a Black lawyer, and he kind of traces the history of the unevenness of the justice system in its application between Blacks and whites. When I was using the term victim, I was using it more in terms of the moment of the crisis. Was that a question? No. Okay. So the issue in Poland in 1938, right, or 1940, when the Nazis were arriving, the Soviets were leaving, is, am I going to stand up for my neighbor in that moment? It's the bystander question. And as Jews, we all always, I've been teaching for years, if only more Germans had stood up for their Jewish neighbors, then maybe the Holocaust would not have taken place with the same kind of violence. In other words, we hold up as a model that a non-Jewish ally of Jews should have intervened in some way to, in social situations, to prevent violence from taking place. That's our expectation or hope.
You're quoting the rabbi's sermon, by the way.
I am. I was thinking, I've been prepared. I've been prepared. So now the question is, how do we interpret that in terms of power threat analysis? So there I am, Trump or anyone makes an awful statement about someone, like about a handicapped person. If I act as an ally to those handicapped people and say, no, that's unacceptable language, because when you say that, you're hurting, you're reinforcing a stereotype that affects all these other people. The moment I do that, the other group is going to feel that they're being threatened because I'm being vocal about it, right? And they feel like their values, they're being called out on this and they're being attacked for this. And the problem is that you should just you shouldn't attack me on it, right? So there's conflict. So there's a real problem with our expectation that bystanders intervene to help victims, because in that moment, it's whatever emotion is being expressed by this slur, whether it's anti-Semitism or whatever, that emotion is very powerful. And the people are going to feel silenced if they're going to feel canceled if their views are not allowed to be put into the public sphere, even if those views are really driven by self-interest or by anger or hatred or whatever else we might see.
You know, those of you who watched the full put together of the George Floyd incident,
Right.
and then in the trial, the effect of those bystanders who were unable
Tell us
do
what,
anything
tell us
about
what happened. Tell us what happened.
Well, what basically happened is you had several people took videos of this and were trying to convince this officer to stop killing this guy.
Right.
And they could not stop him because he obviously had the great power. There are 3 officers sitting there, all of whom are going to defend the one who's going to kneel on the neck. And so they did not have the power to interfere with it. And so in the trial, that what came out, the most horrible feelings came from the people who filmed and who
Could not
tried to
change,
do
could not
something
stop
but
it.
couldn't do something. And so the terrible problem for a person who is put in that position of powerlessness to defend what they know they want to defend is in some ways a motivation for them to try even harder, because when they see the effects on the people who couldn't do enough, they say, God, maybe I could have done just a bit more.
But you know, I think I disagree with you, John, because yes, the people who filmed were not able to affect that situation. So for George Floyd didn't work. But I think it's inconceivable that today a policeman who's doing anything and is being filmed would not think twice about the fact that.
But he did. He did it. He was sitting there. He saw.
But Jacques is saying that there's been a cultural change
Right.
now because of what they did.
We hope so. And so, in fact, that happens all the time. They turn off their body cameras.
Right.
They do it.
Yeah, but again, we live in a world where you carry something
Yes.
that's capable of.
But when there's not a situation where it's obvious, they turn off their body cameras.
So I'd like to share another story of cancel culture in my own family. That might be, when you were speaking, I just realized it, and I think it might be appropriate. So my wife is Black, I'm Jewish, my children are biracial. My father and my mother, we don't have very much contact with my wife's family. My father and my mother come from a very traditional Jewish milieu, a secular one, wholly secular, in spite of the fact that they donated that art back there for all of us. But besides that,
Because I think the rabbi is charming.
so
They
my
get a tax
dad,
deduction.
Yes.
my dad is a very traditional man. He says sexist things all the time.
He says what?
Sexist things all the time. And for a long time, he used to also say racist things, not realizing they were racist, even though he has grandchildren who he loves dearly and my wife who he loves to pieces. He would still, things would come out of his mouth. Over the course of the last 5 years, a change has taken place in our family. It started by my wife, who you'll know, puts up with very little. She started feeling, finally, after 20 years of marriage, that she could say things to my father to call him out. And that empowered my children. And it's when the grandchildren said it and my daughter, boy, she does not stand for when my father comes out with this, particularly the sexist stuff. So my children and my wife are calling out, are canceling my father's speech. And my father has responded at times by saying, this is my house. And I'm paying for everything here, all the food. It's my work that got it, et cetera, which only evokes the socialist in my children, where they say, no, you didn't earn it, stock market. Anyway, besides all of that, the point is.
I'm going to go to your father and say, look, put me in the wheel. I'm not like these ungrateful people. I'm all with you.
The point is that my father is starting to realize that his language is unacceptable and why it's unacceptable. He's realizing it because he loves his grandchildren. He loves his grandchildren. If anyone else in the world said it to him, even his son, it would not have been any different. It was because it came from his grandchildren, for whom there's no complicated relationships, it's just pure love, that he was able to say. So I think there is a way to overcome these differences that we're talking about and to deal with language and speech that's unacceptable, that can still transform hearts and minds if it comes from a place where the relationship is trust and love. And that's why I was referring back to these crazy situations where you have, Black people talking to Klan members and developing relationships with them and becoming friendly with them. And no, they don't give up all their racist attitudes, but they give up some of them, and they're less likely to kill people. In the end, what do we want? We're not going to change human beings. They're still going to believe what they want to believe. We just don't want people to be killing each other on the streets. That would be a good accomplishment, right? So I think there's a way. It just takes a lot of work.
So Pat, I've got the answer. From now on, I'm going to talk politics only with your dog.
It would be great.
She
because
has the same opinions I have.
No, but Pat, I think it would be great because since the dog is deaf, it would be perfect.
Yeah.
Can I say one last thing?
Please,
Yeah.
Pat, you have the final word.
Well, no, it doesn't have to be the final word, but from me, the final word. Drew, you have several times referred to Trump's comment about the handicapped man.
Yeah.
And I want you to note, I'm reading from my notes here. I do not personally know a single Republican who approved of that comment. And we feel that Trump's opponents used his comment to smear all of us. And it's things that happen like that go back to this. When we are made to feel responsible for his comments, because that's kind of what you do when you make those statements, Drew. And I like you a lot, but when I'm around you and you say those kinds of things, it really makes my blood boil.
Well, so who is responsible for his comments? Just him?
He is responsible for his own comments.
But if the party then benefits from him and supports him, then who's responsible for him? So was only Hitler responsible for his anti-Semitism, or the party and the people who supported him?
Well, I suppose you have to say that they all are, but you're not separating us from someone. When I went to the voting booth on that day and I cast a vote for him, it was equally a vote against his opponent. Many people on the right voted that way. We really weren't voting for him. We were voting because we didn't want his opponent to be the president for valid reasons.
Okay, that's exactly what happened in Germany too. People did not want a social democrat in power. They did not, and so they voted for Hitler and supported him.
Yes.
Then all of his policies. Look, I mean, as a Democrat, I have to admit that Johnson and Kennedy also promoted the Vietnam War, and I have to take responsibility for that, even though I like the other things that Johnson did. So I might like the other things, but I'm also responsible for it when I support it. And so again, if we were in a different system where it wasn't a two-party system, where it wasn't just a choice between two people, that we would be having a different conversation. But if we want to believe, I want to be very careful here because I know Jacques really disagrees with the comparison of Trump to Hitler, and there's lots of reasons why they're very different and they should not be compared. So I want to admit that point before I say it.
Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome, because I know he feels very passionately about that.
And it's not so much a defense of Trump.
Trump as a right. Okay, so we all have to make those choices. You're right, and we have to choose between two different candidates that we may or may not like. And sometimes we vote for the person because we don't like the other guy. That's the reason why I like ranked choice voting, because it puts a larger array of candidates out. And then you get to say, I voted first for this guy, and this is my second choice after this first person, which I think is a better way of doing it. So all of those things would improve this situation better. That said, if I am supporting a person who makes statements that are wrong, I'm supporting those statements. So let's take the example of the joke. What was the guy from the Senate who was a Democrat from Minnesota? He was a comedian.
Al Franken.
Al Franken. Actually, I agree with 99% of what that man did when he was in office, or 95% of what he did in office. And he made a mistake, and the Democrats removed him. That's what you do if you sincerely believe that what that person done is wrong. And he made one joke. So,
yeah, I know. That was, well, never mind. I won't.
So the question is, after all of the lies, after all the bad behavior, if you do not remove him from office, then you're saying it's not bad. Do you want to add something to that? Do you want to react to it? Go ahead. I think at some point in time, the party has to be responsible for its own people.
So is the answer then that I'm supposed to vote for the other candidate, even though I didn't like the other candidate for valid reasons? I mean, what's the answer, Jude? This is the system we're stuck with right now. So
there's a really wonderful movement within the Republican Party called the Lincoln Republicans, who are, even though I disagree with 80% of what they say also, they are trying to change the Republican Party to move it away from him because they see it as a threat to the values, the other values that they share within the Republican Party. So I think we still are in a democracy and there's lots of opportunities for being active. But that actually brings us to the other topic I wanted to talk about. We didn't get to it all.
But we have another hour.
Oh, I'm getting tired. All right, so we'll switch to the other topic. And this is the question of resiliency as an individual. How do we stay resilient when when we have certain values in our society and our society is not reflecting it? This is speaking, hopefully, Pat, you feel that this is speaking directly to the question. We want the world to be different and we really feel passionately about it. Either whether that is to remove someone who you don't agree in your party, or in my case, to really change the party fundamentally and shift it in a different direction, whatever it is, you have a passion about the world. The world is very reluctant to change to suit us. How do you stay resilient and focused? And this is, again, I hope you realize I'm taking all this from your sermon. I was sitting there taking notes in my mind. There's a section in the prayer where we are the adoration. We say it every Friday, where we say, we hope someday that everyone's going to be one. There's going to be no more error, no more mistakes.
From one of the prophets.
From one of the prophets, right? This is a really interesting Jewish idea.
I think it's Ezekiel.
It's a really interesting Jewish idea because if you actually push most Jews, they'll tell you, oh, the Messiah, whenever he comes, he'll come, who knows, right? There's actually not really an expectation or a hope that the world is going to fundamentally transform and become perfect. I would argue, having learned this from the rabbi, that this is like a really un-Jewish idea, that everyone is ever going to be perfect.
Well, so what would we have to complain about?
What would we have? And all of our, think of all of our prophets and all of our patriarchs and all of our matriarchs, they were all incredibly faulted, screwed up, effed up people, right? You know, they made mistake after mistake. So it's not really a Jewish idea to have this vision of a perfect world at the end. So then why do we say it? Just for the record, for years and years and years, I only mouthed the words of the adoration of God because this bothered me so much, and I figured it out this afternoon. Why do we still have hope that there's going to be a better world that's going to be perfect, where all these issues will finally disappear?
Hope is the greatest mitzvah.
That's it. That we have.
Hope is the greatest mitzvah.
It allows us
greatest
to get
commandment.
back up again and try. It's what kept. Did you ever see the movie Jacob the Liar? It's a wonderful movie. It's based on a book by a Czech author. It's about the Holocaust, and it's a very simple premise. A kind of a schlemiel, I think you would call him, a ne'er-do-well, is caught in a ghetto, and he finds this little girl who's lost her parents because they've been deported to the death camps. And this is Jacob. And he just kind of ends up taking care of her, even though he's not a very caring person or anything like that. He just ends up taking care of her. And somehow she gets it he says something, and she misunderstands and thinks that he has a radio somewhere hidden, and he knows what's coming. And so he starts telling her stories about this radio, that the Allies are coming, don't worry, what's the latest news? Immediately, this gets out into the entire ghetto. Everyone thinks Jacob now has this radio, and they keep asking for reports, and you can see visibly how it enables them to survive. It built resilience. And then he was in a problem because he was a liar, and he had to keep telling this. The end of the story is they all die. They're all dead. That's the end of the story. It's a Holocaust story. It's a tragedy. But the point is that Jacob was able to help them live more human lives as they were going along because they had hope.
Right. Viktor Frankl talks about it. How when people lost hope, they're called Musulman.
That would be the end of them.
Right.
So when it comes to promoting whatever your beliefs are, whether they're Pat's, which I never knew, but obviously are different from mine, or John's, or the rabbis, whatever your beliefs are, and you're active in the community, there are people like Joyce who don't stop, who can do this every day, nonstop, without losing her focus. That's not most human beings. Most human beings get demoralized. We get tired. We believe that our views are not being properly reflected. We believe that we're never going to be able to make the change that we believe in. And then you give up and you get angry and you feel guilty. What I heard from the rabbi's speech, particularly yesterday, was it's okay. So take care of yourself, rest, and then get up the next day and try again. Or for whatever it is that you
Say they say in rabbinical school that you don't need to hit your whole congregation. You just hit one person well, it could last them a lifetime.
There you go. There you go. I think this is all coming from this woman who does resiliency training here in the community. And she ties it to environmental work because she sees resiliency as connecting to the natural environment. So she's a wacko lefty like me. But the point is that what she says is when you rest from whatever work you're doing for the community, you're also doing work. In other words, because
Building resilience.
because you're building your own internal resilience. And she made the analogy she made is like when you're doing exercise when you're doing like repetitions for sports training or something like that. There's a whole period of time where your body will go up, you'll get better. And then there'll be a whole long period of time where your body is internalizing what you've observed. And then all of a sudden you'll get up again. So that period of stagnancy when you are too angry with the world at the way it is and you want it to change and you feel like you're not doing anything is actually work that's being done to prepare you for the next step. So she has a really good message, I think. And that would be true of whatever your beliefs are.
Says in Pirkei Avot, not up to you to finish the job, neither you're free to give up on it.
In volunteering, we teach people they need to take care of themselves in order to continue, like during a disaster or anything like that. We
Right.
need people to take care of themselves before they go out and try to take care of someone else. Because if you can't take care of yourself, you can't help someone.
So whenever this issue comes up, I always think of the Dalai Lama, who has this very clear statement that self-love is the beginning of love of others as well. But I've always wondered, Rabbi, is there a specific place in Torah or Talmud that that makes this point that you have to take care of yourself in order to take care of others?
Oh, I mean, I can think of some Hasidic stories.
Okay.
Of that. There's a story of this Rebbe, Hasid Tamir, the guy is very wealthy, and he tells the Rebbe, look, Rebbe, I do as the Talmud says, I sleep on the floor, and I eat very simple meals with just water and bread. And the Rebbe says, oh, you're doing bad. You're a rich man. You need to sleep in a big bed with pillows, with feather covers, and you need to eat big meals with bread and vegetables and meat. The disciples said, okay, he leaves. And then the disciples are right. But what he said is right. It does say you should live a simple life, sleep on the floor, eat bread. Yeah, but if he survives on bread and water, he's going to think that the poor can survive on stones.
Right.
So, and that is going to come to my mind.
It's close. It's close.
I knew we'd get along. I knew we'd get around to the justification of your being a plutocrat.
Well, but there's an underlying reality. It's an understanding of human psychology also, which is that you have to satisfy. I think so much about the problems that we face in society today are based on spiritual poverty, like where people have just experienced loss or not had their needs met, and so they think there's not enough to go around, even though we live in the richest period of human history ever in the history of mankind, and yet people still feel like they have to have only things for themselves because of whatever the lack of meeting our needs that we experienced early in life. And I think there's such a long tradition of that lack of meeting those needs that we're facing that challenge.
And then they're not teaching it to their children either, because we now teach resilience at school.
Yes.
Because we have a lot of kids that come to school with no coping skills.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a really great study, I'm sure you know it, where the marshmallow study.
Yes.
You know this one, right? Where they found out that kids who come from families that don't have money or where there's a lot of violence in the streets, that if you say to them, you can either have one marshmallow now, or you can have as many marshmallows as you want tomorrow, those kids are much more likely to grab the one marshmallow. If you come from a family that had health and safety as a basic prerequisite in your life, they are able to say, oh, I'm going to wait and I'm going to save. And the reason why this matters and why it was related to education is that it literally is a predictor of your ability to complete your homework. Because completing homework is predicated on your ability to say, I will play later rather than now if I just get my homework done. And that's an absolute core skill for success in school. So you might be perfectly intelligent, but if you don't have this character trait, what's the word for the character trait?
Resilience.
Resiliency. If you don't have that, then there's no way that you're going to be able to succeed no matter how smart you are and how talented you are. And apparently it's not something that can be taught retroactively. It's if at a certain age you have had
Delayed gratification is not built in.
delayed gratification has to be learned by your needs being met at an early age. I don't know what the year break off is, but if you try to learn it later, it's always something that still structures your behavior. That's why having, addressing things like poverty and care at an early age for a child is so essential.
I mean, a mantra that we repeat all day long also because kids are not being taught that now is I can do difficult things
Even if I don't want to.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
All right, you've talked me out. I've talked a lot. I want to go home and go to sleep for the rest of the day so I don't have to think about food anymore.
Dream.
Yeah, let's-
John, Pat, thank you so much. It was really interesting.
I hope you liked it.
I
hope it was-
really did. It was great. Thank you all.
Okay, and thank you, Pat, for sharing your views. I really,
Oh, thank you for letting me go on you.
we don't, just because the rest of the world isn't civil doesn't mean we have to do.
That's right.
I'll tell another really quick story. My father, as I said, is, I would say he's a centrist to right Democrat. And he's a relatively wealthy man compared to any measure in the rest of humanity. He's not a 1%er, but he lives a very happy life. And he goes to a golf club, a golf country club in New York where we live. And he and his friends are all other very successful people who have been able to pocket a lot of money over the course of their lives. Almost all of them did not come from money, but all of them made their money in the 80s and the 90s. And they have a conversation group, Pat, on Thursdays. They call it TOFAB, Tough Old Farts at Breakfast. And it is a range of people from Democratic socialists all the way through to staunch Trump supporters. And they all have breakfast. And I've been invited as a talking head to this group to clarify positions on things like what is critical race theory and things like that. So they've invited me to come speak. And this, of course, gets me very upset sometimes that I don't want to go, but they've also invited my wife to speak about her experiences. And when I realized how unique it was, I invited a journalist to come as well. And they were interviewed by a radio journalist from Germany and the journalist said, she found this amazing because this is not the story that you hear in the news today. You don't hear stories of people sitting. She said, I don't care what everyone said. What I care about is that they're saying it and that they're listening to each other. And that was so remarkable to her because her job has been reporting on America in the age of Trump to Germany. And because she works for Germany radio. And you don't hear in the news that there are people who are talking to each other, having civil conversations. And so she's going to report on my father's group having this conversation because she thinks it's important for people to realize that there is civility out there and that in part the media has invented this myth that we don't talk to each other.
Yes. And I wonder if the media understands that if they would just stop reporting on him.
No, they won't, Pat.
I know, but if they would stop reporting on him, he thrives.
There's
publicity.
but that's bringing us back to the government issue. Just like gerrymandering, there's a structural problem with the way the media works.
Yes, there
Because
is.
they benefit from disagreement, even
Yes.
where there is no real disagreement.
Yes.
Yeah.
My question would be how to, and I've posed this before, with the groups, how do we get that between these groups?
They had relationships prior that mattered to them. They were golfing and tennis buddies. And so they could talk about other things, and that transitioned into a position where they could have, so they had certain degrees of trust. Pat and I obviously don't agree with each other on politics, but I imagine that she and I could go out to a Chinese restaurant and have a conversation because we already had a bond by sharing our common community. So that brings us back to that point I was trying to make before, that when you live in a integrated but not assimilated community, where you can say, I don't agree with your ideas, but you're a part of my community. Those are the practices that enable us to have difficult conversations like this and still remain neighbors and friends and community.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Kansas City Star on Mondays, I believe, has a section in the back of the front section, 2 pages of good news stories. It's really charming to go back there and feel good to see, look at what this youngster did to raise all this money for blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And so it's maybe the news is catching on a little bit. I hope.
I'm skeptical. I think they have a real incentive. There's even what's the policy called? It's called there's even a formal name for it. And so, for instance, in the case of the vaccines, there really aren't 2 positions on the issue, right? There are not. Vaccines are not unhealthy for you. They don't put microchips in your body. And 99% of doctors in the world think that they're healthy. What would you say, Dr. Scheinman?
Well, sure, of course.
So, but then to present, when one could argue that this entire crisis has been created by the media, by presenting the other view that vaccines are dangerous as another option, reasonable option view. And so that's the kind of the difficulty, that the span of choices of what we do about whether we should have boosters, how fast it should be done. There are lots of issues we should be talking about with vaccines, but whether or not they're effective shouldn't be one of them. But that made a lot of money for a lot of news media. So it became an issue.
Well, it isn't just the media. You know, it is also a power issue.
Right.
And I think I mentioned sometime this last year in public, I went to GAR, Rabbi's Episcopal friend, to learn a little bit more about how to do Zoom better, and while we were there, I was talking to him about this crazy business of all these loony ideas that keep coming out, and why do otherwise perfectly rational people go along with this craziness? And I thought his thought about that was pretty good, that basically a lot of people cannot tolerate complexity. And science is
It's
complexity. And so when you feel that you're a smart guy, you can handle anything, you know everything, and yet you don't really understand how that puts together. And furthermore, they won't give me a straight answer.
So then you want a simple answer.
Then you can buy a belief system that may be totally crazy, but it's completely internally consistent.
Well, just to go back to the rabbi's speech today, even though I disagreed with many of his characterizations and he got his history wrong, the fact is that for ideological communists, for many ideological communists, the theory of history that Marx offered a clear and concrete explanation of the way all of human history works, and they reduced it down to a very simple equation that was wrong, that in its simplicity was wrong. I'll give you a really great example to support your criticism of communism. See, look how generous I'm being today.
You always are.
East Germany announced that real existing socialism had been realized by the 1960s. In other words, it wasn't just a future goal, we did it. This was a propaganda attempt to say that life in the Eastern world, the Eastern Bloc was better than life in the Western Bloc. And by the way, in the 1960s, the differences between the West and the East were not that egregious. It was only really in the 70s and the 80s where
After
things started.
communism
Well,
succeeded
it
for a while.
started to become more sclerotic, and by the 80s, it became really clear that capitalism is more powerful. In the 60s, it wasn't quite so clear yet. But divorced people in East Germany, since you were given houses, divorce was not recognized as a problem because we've resolved all class conflict. And since class conflict is the only explanation that we have for why there's conflict in a society, divorce can't be a problem. So they didn't recognize that getting divorced was a source for tension. And the result was that you couldn't apply for a new house. So you had to live with your ex-wife or your ex-husband in your apartment while both of you were going off and getting remarried with other people. And this created incredible tensions in everyday life. And it is an example of someone who had an explanation for the way the world works. All problems are class-based. That's the source of all problems. And if you can't explain it in that way, then it's not a problem. The problem doesn't exist. That's right. That's right. Okay, so there's an example of leftist simplistic thinking that created more problems by fitting what you were saying about by
And
not
so
accepting
now,
complexity.
take us back to the present,
Yeah.
this difficulty with the honest, perfectly honest CDC and NIH and FDA, all of them being perfectly honest. Nobody's, pushing them off into the corner like Mr. Trump did. They're all allowed to say the honest things they believe, and the media is going crazy about how, why don't they get their act straight out? Why don't they do it right? Why don't they make it simple? Why don't they make it simple?
Complicated. That's right.
Yeah, why don't they make it simple? Because they're being honest. And what's wrong with being honest?
Another example would be the theory of evolution. Yes, it's a theory, but it is a theory that's been proven to such a degree that it can be taken as a fact, even if there are ways that are changing it. But if you get into an argument with a creationist, they will tell you that it's just a theory and I have my own theory, right? So it's reducing the problem, a complicated problem, to something that's simple. But look, I explained this power threat thing to you, right? It took us like a good hour to get through it, and it's complicated, and it doesn't leave you feeling like when you get done reading this idea and thinking about it, you're not suddenly feeling good like you're going to go skipping down the block, right? Because you realize how complicated the problem is. So this is called a thorny problem. Is that the right word? No, I think it is. So there's a concept in sociology and political science that certain issues in the solution to the problem sometimes exacerbate that problem or another problem. And that's why they remain unsolved problems for such a long time. Poverty is one of them. Poverty is a classic problem where you think that you're solving the problem one way and it creates new problems in the other. The classic example here is the housing projects from the 1960s. Because on the one hand, they looked like it was a great solution to the problem of poverty because you would give people a place to live. They didn't have a place to live. If you don't have a place to live, you need a place to live. So you gave it to them. And then, of course, you had concentrations of poor Black people, poor Latino people in one area, which then accelerated crime because they were poor and they didn't have very many other options. And so that's an example of these kind of thorny problems. And if you simplify it and you just make it about race, or you just make it about class, or you try to solve the problem easily, it really requires a multidisciplinary, complicated, very carefully thought through strategy to try to resolve the issue. I would argue Afghanistan is another example. I mean, you've been there, you could maybe talk to it more specifically. But every time anyone's tried to solve one problem in Afghanistan, it just created the opposite problem in reverse. And that's society. That's the reality. Like, there aren't simple solutions to things. Does that sell in the news media? I don't think so. Not in 30 seconds, right?
Well, some of us have the luxury of being able to spend longer reading. And so, I mean, you know, it's just that, you know, science, I tried to teach my 11-year-old granddaughter about science. I said, it's all a business of 5%. That's it. If there is a 5%, a 95% chance on the basis of all the stuff you put together, that this is the most likely answer, we call it truth.
Macro.
All right. But it is uncertain. It's always uncertain. And it's going to change because the next study is going to counteract that. And so if you want an answer, what is truth? Not going to get it. And so unless somebody tells me this is the truth, every time I hear that, I want to know what is the percentage chance, and furthermore, how is that conclusion powered? In other words, is there enough of a sample taken to justify a 5%, the 5% error or the 95% confidence limit going to the next study? And she answered back, hey, I'm 11.
So I would add another thing to this discussion that I've been thinking a lot about recently, through this conversation with this TOFAF group, okay, because the dynamic of the group was progressives like me would offer a solution, and from the right, it would be criticized. And this went on for weeks at a time. And usually it started with some newspaper article where there was some progressive policy being promoted, Black Lives Matters or something like that, and there was a counter. So I think we should take the Talmudic answer to this question, which is, in order to really get to the truth on an issue, you have to argue the other side with as all the vehemence that you possibly can. So it's a really fascinating idea.
By the way, that's exactly what the 95% is.
Exactly. But the other side to it, I don't know if this was part of the Talmudic practice, the rabbi can tell us, but the practice would be, you don't get to just say no. If someone says, no, that's not going to work, then you have to give a counter proposal that's actually a concrete proposal that has evidence that it could succeed. And if it's a proposal that has already been used and failed, you don't get to promote it anymore. So you don't get to say, well, why don't we stick with this if it hasn't worked, right? You have to come up with an actual solution to the problem. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying, I like that. We should do more. It's like when my children were kids, I would say, okay, you have a problem, bring me a solution.
Yes.
And, you know, I use that with the people that I work with. Don't just bring me a problem. You need to bring me a solution to help solve this problem.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be the solution, but you can at least give a suggestion for that solution.
And please make it pragmatic, that's remotely realistic in being realized. Yeah.
I mean, we don't all have a solution, but if we work together to provide that solution, we make that.
Jacques, did you want to add?
No, just say that when you study Talmud, in a traditional academy, you have a chavruta, you have a partner, right? So one would argue one point, the other. It would not be uncommon for the teacher to come in and say, switch. Right. That's what, sharpens people's thinking.
And what would be nice about that, for instance, in the whole argument about Black Lives Matters, is that, or anti-Semitism or BDS, any of these issues that are driven by passion and emotion, is that you could no longer just argue the things that you believe because of your emotional commitment to them. You would have to actually make your argument based on something else, because clearly I'm not going to argue from a position that my inclination is going to argue passionately for the things I believe, right? So if you're forced to argue for the other side, and I'm sure they were very passionate about those debates.
Sure, yeah.
But to force you to fight for the other side means you have to distance yourself from your own emotional commitment to whatever your own beliefs are and try to get to an actual solution.
Or at least on the way, get to a point where you believe that there is at least some validity to the other side.
Exactly.
It's also true.
Okay, can I go home now? I'm tired.
Well, no.
Stay for the word?
No, I'm fine.
So why were you criticizing this business about, it's going to be wonderful and heaven on earth? Why? We all agreed.
I think the hope for purity and everyone being perfect is a not Jewish idea. I think the hope for it is Jewish, but I think imagining that you're going to purify human beings and fix them is the source of most of the problems of modern society or human society. That's what forced conversion's been about. That's what forcing people to learn languages that aren't their native language.
Well, it also has something to do with your definition of purity. It is me.
That's right. But that's
Purity is me.
But read the text. That's what it says. It says that Judaism is basically implying that Judaism is going to become the religion of all human beings. Right. And that's the part that would bother me. But now I would read it differently, and I can accept it this way, where I would say that it's the hope that human beings will realize their unity. That I can agree with.
What about those of us, I've asked Rabbi about this, what about those of us that sin so much we will never be cured?
That's my whole point. I don't think the desire for that is itself dangerous, because I think human beings are faulted and we're meant to be faulted. Yeah, that's what makes me nervous. Because then I hear racists saying we have to exterminate all the different races, and I hear the communists saying we have to get rid of all the capitalists, and I hear anyone trying to say I'm going to perfect society. Oh, scary. But they try every time. Now, think about how many movements in the 20th century have tried to perfect human beings. This one certainly will never be perfect.
Ask Denise.
Yeah, exactly.
A pocket-sized CRISPR will help.
What's a pocket size?
That's the thing that you can splice genes in and out of DNA.
Oh. Yeah, that's talk about a danger for.
That's a scary thought.
Well, but some of the things are not so scary. Some of them are absolutely what you'd want to happen, because there are ways of doing experiments safely, and to make them inheritable, that is the difference. And so that's why stem cell transplant is, nobody questions that. That's just fine, because it only affects the person you do it to.
Right.
But it can inherited to fix the DNA. That's the problem, because you don't know where it's going.
I think the crowd is dispersing. So
The crowd they've exhausted them.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Drew.
Gary, Bessie looks comfortable.
Yes,
She
it
is.
really was. How are you feeling?
She woke up.
How are you feeling, Pat?
Well, a couple days ago wasn't a great day, but I'm better today. Thank you.
Good.
Bessie woke up. She must have heard her name.
Oh, she did. She's waiting for a walk.
Yeah. Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Help open the